no one should have to choose between their own safety and their pets. But nearly half of domestic abuse survivors delay leaving because they can't bring their pets with them. Purina is helping to create more pet-friendly domestic violence shelters through the Purple Leash Project, so survivors and their pets can escape and heal together. Visit Purina.com/purple to learn more.
This October, the Wrong Station celebrates a decade of dread. You can read the show notes to discover terrible new ways to celebrate with us. Today's episode, The Table, is written by Jacob Duarte Spiel and performed by Anthony Botelho. Stafford had a headache. He was lying across the back seat with his dinner jacket over his face. He'd had it before the chauffeur picked him up, before the private jet took off, before he'd woken up in the penthouse at Saffron Plaza, still high on whatever he'd taken the night before. He'd probably been dreaming of the headache. Not that he remembered his dreams. He was late, of course. Very late. His phone buzzed. Stafford looked at the blinding screen through his fingers. A text from his mother, the first in months. It read, "Be on your best behavior." Funny. That's what the last message said, too. The chauffeur maneuvered along the twisting 1-mile-long driveway and stopped at the front door. Slightly queasy, Stafford hoisted himself up and stepped out into the punishing humidity, throwing his jacket back on. He'd been gifted the suit on his 30th birthday. It was utterly black, made from a Gonin wasp filament and threaded with lumen fiber for a shimmer effect. Despite looking as solid as obsidian, the fabric was light and airy, perfect for the weather. The chauffeur delicately closed the door behind him as he stood, stretching on the driveway. The house was just as massive as ever, an old colonial mansion circa 2485, or was it 2584? Stafford could never remember that shit. The first had added the gardens in the back. The second had expanded the wine cellar. But the third had governed over the true expansion of the property, the west and south courtyards, the top 3 floors, the menagerie of planetary specimens, the trophy room. As the fortune of the corporation grew, so did the estate. Stafford sighed and rubbed his temples. This was only going to be fun if he made it fun. He glanced around and, seeing nobody, retrieved a little vial of cocaine from his ticket pocket. The classics are classics for a reason. The headache receded. Stafford entered through the enormous double doors, made from some kind of local alien wood. 2 butlers greeted him just inside. They were both locals as well, just like the rest of the house staff, descendants of the first colony ship that landed here a few centuries ago. Through polite gestures and nods, they made it clear that he was late, very late, and needed to make his way to the dining room. Stafford walked down the main hall, letting his tasteful antique leather shoes squeak on the marble the entire way. It wasn't hard to find his plate. Stafford's was the only empty seat. The third was known for punishing anyone who left the table during a family meal. If you couldn't show dedication to your kin for a single evening, how could you be trusted in the family business? And there the third was, squatted at the head of the table like a moldy tree trunk. Stafford didn't look around, just walked quickly to the table and took his place. Thankfully, he'd come in when the conversation was loud. Only a few people even noticed his entrance. Their glances were amused and vicious in turn, but no one spoke up. The third was as liable to excoriate a snitch as a latecomer. He saw his parents, sitting in their assigned spots across from him, a few chairs toward the head of the table. They looked briefly in his direction, then away. Can't give too much attention to the latecomer. "Aw, missing Mummy and Daddy?" said a sing-songy voice in his left ear. Winona, of course. The seating plans had been set since Stafford was 4 years old, and yet he always managed to forget Winona, the thorn in his left side. Sometimes he wondered if the third had known she'd grow up to be a Class A bitch, and had put them together to ensure he'd be tortured. Stafford looked at her and did his best to scoff and say something approaching cleverness. His tongue stumbled, looking for the perfect mix of humor, aggression, and carelessness. But he came up with nothing. In the end, he just rolled his eyes and looked away. It didn't help that she was impossibly attractive, the kind of uncanny allure that's only possible when you have millions to spend on treatments and injections. The same treatments and injections Stafford also dutifully received. Something had almost happened between them years ago, after a dinner much like this one. But of course, that could never be real. No cousins cavorting, or experimenting, or fucking. The family had enough scandals, enough whispers of incestuous affairs floating around the gossip channels, enough monstrous children rotting away in secret, off-world facilities. Besides, Winona made more money than him now, which meant she had a familial obligation to hate him. Stafford busied himself by looking up and down the 75-foot table. It was possible that, besides the infants and invalids, Stafford was the lowest-income person at this dinner. And maybe the infants were pulling in trust fund dividends he didn't know about. He chewed on an ice-cold appetizer that the staff must have put there about a half-hour earlier. It was still, of course, delicious, a local seafood dish with the rural edges sanded off, elevated by inner-rim culinary geniuses, and then balanced perfectly with lime juice from the only lime trees on the entire planet, which grew in the third's greenhouses. As Stafford reached for more, his steak knife caught the edge of his sleeve and fell off the table. He moved his foot instinctively, trying to catch it before the metal blade clattered on the floor. He didn't need more eyes on him. The knife landed blade down, puncturing the pebbled water buffalo leather of his shoes, his spider silk socks, and just barely drawing blood from the top of his foot. It stood straight up for a moment before slowly toppling over onto the ground. He grimaced and ducked his head under the long, trailing tablecloth to retrieve the knife. Stafford searched the folds of cloth, muttering, and then stopped. Something caught his eye. Attached under the table, directly between him and the person across from him, was something that looked very much like a package wrapped in clear plastic. Wires stuck out of it at odd angles, and on a screen from an old clock radio, bright red numbers counted down. 21:35, 21:34, 21:33. Stafford stared at the bomb, frozen. He watched 17 seconds tick off the timer until Winona jabbed him with her elbow. He grabbed his knife and straightened up. "Aye, already, huh?" she said between her teeth. Or someone wearing a skirt and no underwear. Fucking dumbass. There was... Stafford stumbled to find the words, but Winona was already speaking to Aunt Edith across the table, bragging about a vacation she'd taken last month. To Mars, visiting the red mountains of the old country. Stafford's hands flexed. His breathing came short and fast. The cocaine was out of his system by now. This was pure adrenaline. He fumbled with his phone, fingers jittering across the screen as he put in a timer for... He ducked his head back under the table. 19 minutes and 49 seconds. Should he tell someone? That would be the logical thing to do. Clearly, someone wanted them out of the way. Was it the rare earth metal cartel? Those upstarts at Astorium? Stafford leaned forward, trying to make eye contact with his parents a few seats down. Their eyes flickered to him, and away, as if he wasn't there. He looked down the table for someone else to alert, then up, and then down again. A thought began to break through the panic. What the fuck was he doing, pussyfooting around? This was an emergency, an actual emergency. He could scream, yell, grab someone, and force them to look. But he didn't. His instincts told him not to. But why? He took a deep, deep breath, and suddenly all of his financial lessons, accounting classes, economic theory, all the things he'd learned from his family's tutors and private schools, all the business tactics he thought he'd forgotten, they all came flooding back. Why should he tell anyone? Mentally, Stafford recited the line of succession, which he'd had memorized since he was 10. He checked off each person at the table until, yes, he got to himself. If he stepped away, when the bomb did its job, he'd be in charge. The third would be dead, and he would be the fourth, CEO of Terraformations Incorporated, and head of the family. His life, his future, his world all transformed in one fiery instant. He would be rich beyond his wildest dreams, the majority shareholder in the largest, most essential company in the galaxy. It meant control. Real control. Not just over his life, but control over the lives of everyone on dozens of planets, billions of people. His knee bounced rapidly. It was a big change. Did he really want that? Yes, he wanted that. He definitely wanted that. But was he ready? Was he ready? Good question. 18 minutes and 15 seconds. He looked up at the table, at the third, and really took him in for the first time that night. A disgusting old toad in a shapeless pinstriped suit. More like a muumuu, designed to hide the tumors and goiters and boils that covered his ancient body. What was he now? 120? 150 years old? A far cry from the cutthroat businessman who used to use his wealth like a hammer. As Stafford watched, a butler delicately placed a spoonful of something into the third's mouth. The third's artificial hand flew up and knocked the spoon away. Maybe it had been too hot, or too cold, or maybe the third just felt like it. He grabbed the butler's wrist and squeezed, digging his claws in hard enough to draw blood. The rest of the table didn't react, didn't even notice. They carried on with their own meals and conversations. The third, still gripping the writhing butler, glanced down the table. He briefly made eye contact with Stafford. Stafford immediately looked away. It felt like a cold stone had dropped into his stomach. Surely the third was just a figurehead now. Terraformations basically ran itself, had been running itself since the third was a child. Not like it's a complicated business model. Send big machines to planets ahead of colony ships. Colonizers take on debt of terraforming. Collect the monthly payments with a healthy dose of interest. Stafford snuck a peek back up the table. The third had released the butler and was now leaning back in his chair, slowly falling asleep. All right, so he was ready. So he could do whatever he wanted. And if this was how he took power, the lone survivor of corporation-on-corporation violence, well, maybe not. Maybe he wanted the other dynasty heads and CEOs to believe he planted the bomb. That would be cutthroat. Well, that would be badass. They'd stay out of his backyard for sure. No more encroachments in the terraforming industry. Not unless they wanted a bomb under their boardroom table. Winona was looking at him again, eyes narrowed in disgust, like he was some rodent she'd shish kebabbed on her stiletto. Why the fuck are you smiling? He didn't realize he had been. Apps are really good this year, that's all, he said. Don't speak to me, said Winona. Stafford suddenly wondered if Winona had it in her. The it that Stafford didn't have, never had. The willingness to burn down everything to get what you want. even your own family. He was willing to profit from someone else burning it down, sure, but he'd never be the guy to actually set up the bomb. Winona, on the other hand, had she planted it herself? Fuck no. Winona didn't know shit about bombs, which meant she had an accomplice. He chewed the inside of his cheek until he started to taste copper. Gone were the thoughts of corporate sabotage. He was now certain it was Winona's bomb. It made perfect sense. It was right under her spot at the table, after all. Stafford's head was pounding. He needed more coke. He slipped his hand into his pocket and dusted his fingers in the powder. Stafford rubbed his fingers on his gums, pretending to pick something out of his teeth. The drug gave him clarity. Whether anyone else knew it, this was a war. He needed to ally with her immediately. All he had to do was ask her the right question. Let her know without telling her he knew. Let her know he was on her side. But before he could, Winona stood up, all 6'2" of her, and started walking away. Shit, so she was leaving. Getting out before the bomb went off and... Stafford checked his phone. 15 minutes. Cold sweat sprang up on his neck. Even if he got out of the room in time and survived, he wouldn't get far. She'd cut off his accounts, hunt him down, and put a gun in his mouth. If he could just manage to reach her, speak to her in private, it would be okay. They could work together. Maybe they could be together. Wherever she was going, he had to catch her, right now, and beg for his life. Stafford pushed his chair away from the table. The brass feet squealed as they left claw marks in the marble flooring. He winced. The room fell silent. At the head of the table, the third's roomy eyes slowly opened and turned to the sound. He saw Stafford frozen halfway between sitting and standing. A sneer plucked at his lips. His voice crackled in the silent, empty space.
"Well?"
he said. "Bathroom," Stafford replied. "Just need the bathroom."
"Of course. Not everyone cares about the sanctity of the family meal. Not everyone deserves a place at this table. Not everyone can control their bladder,"
said the third.
"First floor, east wing. 7th door to the right."
At this, the entire table burst into peals of laughter. It rang from the walls, echoed off the rafters, pummeled Stafford's head like hailstones. Cousins and aunts and uncles, and his own parents and siblings howled with glee and relief, each one a hyena's laugh, evolved for survival, not a true expression of emotion. And yet Stafford burned red. He knew the layout of this home just like anyone else. He knew each bathroom. He knew there were at least 9 closer than 1st floor, east wing, 7th door on the right. The third had told him to use the servants' toilet. Winona screeched along with everyone else. She hadn't left, hadn't even intended on leaving. She was just showing Aunt Edith photos of her vacation. Stafford stood and exited, letting the gales of laughter push the doors closed behind him. One of the butlers bowed to him as he exited. The hallway was cool and dry. He took off walking towards the east wing, the butler silently following at a respectful distance. Stafford felt the moisture level rise as he left the temperature-regulated main house and entered the humid regions, where the true weather of the planet's eastern hemisphere brushed hot and sweaty fingers against his skin. There was no reason to have climate control here. This is where the servants lived. Stafford found the bathroom, realizing only then he hadn't needed to come all this way. No one was tracking him. But then also realizing he really did have to piss, and one toilet was as good as another. The butler opened the door for him, and he went inside. He sat there, squeaking his shoes against the damp tile, and considered the bomb. His high had evened out now, and things seemed murkier. Obviously, it was no surprise that someone wanted to kill the third and wipe out the family line. Even Stafford could see that. People probably tried shit like this a dozen times a year. Only this time they'd succeeded. When he thought about it, the third probably had a lot of enemies. He was nothing but a calculator looking for the largest sum. He wasn't a leader. He didn't have charisma, aside from an acidic sense of humor. Didn't matter if he burned his contractors, crippled his competitors, or hurt his family in the process. A stiffed contractor, Stafford hadn't even considered that. The murk deepened. Competitors, family, and now contractors? Who was it? He had only minutes to figure it out and offer some kind of deal. Or maybe he didn't have to offer just one. What if he put a deal on the table for each potential party before the clock hit 0? He gamed it out in his head. If he made a veiled overture to Winona, and she wasn't the assassin, well, that loose end would instantly tie itself. He had a contact at Historium, a VP he'd gone to college with. He would reach out, vaguely mention working together, once this was all over. If they were the culprits, he would sell them half the company. He'd keep the other half, of course. Half of the biggest firm in space would still be more than enough to see him through. He was a humble guy, after all. If it was a contractor, that was trickier. Terraformations had thousands of contractors. But all he'd have to do was initiate a full investigation. The culprits would get skittish and either make a mistake or threaten to murder him too. A few $1 billion under the table would go a long way towards reconciliation. Or maybe he'd just have them killed. Depends on who it was. Stafford squeaked his shoes against the tile and shook off the last few drops of piss. He frowned. There was a hole in his underwear. The day he became the richest man in the galaxy, and he had a hole in his underwear. He heard a soft knock on the bathroom door. Stafford flinched. He'd forgotten the butler. He washed his hands quickly and opened the door. The butler stood directly in front of him, his face just a foot away. Stafford looked him in the eyes for the first time that night. He'd have to learn the names of a few of the staff, the ones who survived the blast anyway. He began to ask, "What's your name?" But the question died on his lips. Stafford always assumed the house staff was young. The third liked them that way. But up close, this particular butler didn't look young at all. His face was gouged with old scars. Stafford met his right eye, avoiding the left one, which stared milky and unseeing over his shoulder. The white had overtaken the pupil, but a little auburn iris still showed through. Stafford was reminded of an over-easy egg and gagged silently. They looked at and past each other for a long while, the butler standing with his shoulders back, but in an easy, confident stance. Stafford shuffled his feet. "Ready to go back, sir?" asked the butler, his native accent light and melodic. Stafford shook his head and took out his phone. "No, I've got a few messages to send out. I'll go back in a few minutes." "I really think you should go back, sir." Stafford glared up from the text he'd been typing to Winona. The butler kept his easy stance, but now his one seeing eye was hard as iron. Stafford's mouth went dry. Something fell into place. You. And it was as if the entire house had been flooded with light for the first time. All up and down the hallway, the butlers, cooks, maids, and drivers were entering from back rooms and hallways and around corners. They came and stood along the walls, chatting softly with each other in the region's native language. A few watched Stafford with the same hard eyes, the same easy stance. The butler gestured down the hall towards the dining room. "Sir, it's time to go back," he said. Stafford looked from face to face to face, licked his lips, and said in a small voice, Okay. The dining room door clicked shut behind him, and Stafford felt, rather than heard, the deadbolt lock slide into place. Besides his, every seat was filled. Someone had brought the next course while he'd been out. He sat down. Winona spared him a sideways look of disgust and then went back to her meal. Nobody had noticed that the family was alone in the room. The staff were all gone. Stafford looked at his phone. 45 seconds left. Even if he told everyone, what were the chances they all made it out alive? First, he'd have to get everyone's attention. And would they even listen? They'd probably just laugh. 35 seconds. It was better this way. Was it better this way? Maybe. He wasn't sure. Oh well, it wasn't his job to figure it out anymore. He swiped the alarm off his screen. A wave of calm washed over him. He took out his vial of Coke and shook a little pile onto his palm. Then a little more. Then a little more. He turned to Winona. You want some? The Wrong Station is made possible with the generous support of our listeners on Patreon. Join us today at patreon.com/The Wrong Station for bonus episodes, behind-the-scenes content, ad-free listening, and additional goodies celebrating our decade of dread. The Wrong Station is co-produced by Alexander Saxton, Anthony Botelho, and Jacob Duarte Spiel, with music composed and performed by Alon Citrin, and arranged for the viola and performed by Viola Schmidt. You can follow us on social media at The Wrong Station, or email us at thewrongstation@gmail.com. And until next time, thank you for listening.